The world's second largest grower of cocoa and Africa's second largest producer of gold is facing hard times, maybe the hardest times yet. Holders of Ghana's Eurobonds have formed a creditor committee to represent the interests of institutional investors, including mutual funds, asset managers, insurance firms, hedge funds, and family offices. Now, in a statement released on Monday, the group asked Ghana's government to refrain from taking further unilateral action and declared that it had retained the services of a law firm. This comes after Ghana asked holders of its international bonds to accept losses of as much as 30% on their principal debt and forego interest payments for 3 years. It also appealed to domestic debt investors to voluntarily exchange existing securities for new ones that will offer a zero coupon in the first year, 5% in the second, and 10% in the third. But that proposal seemed to have failed to inspire confidence. The government suspended interest payments on $13 billion of Eurobonds, as well as commercial loans and most bilateral obligations, pending the conclusion of a restructuring deal. Now, the country has secured a $3 billion staff-level deal with the IMF, a silver lining in what appears to be a very stormy economic cloud. Joining me now is Emmanuel Amoah Darkwah. He is an economist and partner at advisory firm C-Kadd Global, and of course, a friend of the house. Emmanuel, we're back again looking at what ails Ghana as it may be. This latest, I guess we might say, salvo from this committee bringing a different dimension. So I want to quickly quote what the committee has said, and we'll start from there. So the committee says it notes that a process of good faith negotiation would avoid unilateral actions and would require the timely exchange of detailed economic and financial information among the committee, the Ghanaian authorities, and the IMF, and would need to be anchored in reasonably feasible economic adjustments by the Ghanaian authorities. And that's really what this creditors committee is asking for, which is being steered by some well-known firms in the finance world. In particular, why do you think they're sort of specific about those two particular things, the timely exchange of this information, avoiding unilateral action as well? What do you think?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. In any domestic or external debt restructuring, it means that you are altering the terms of the agreement you agreed on when you were signing onto a bond agreement. And so what it basically means is that they look forward to negotiations, and they wouldn't want the Ghanaian authorities to be making unilateral decisions. And also, more importantly, the program has to be orderly so that you don't disrupt a lot of investors, their returns and all that. So they basically are asking that government, in making decisions going forward, we have to do broader negotiations. But government will also have to take a share in burden, take a share in sharing the burden that the investors are also going to take. Because once you are restructuring, you might alter the coupon rate, you might alter the tenure of the loans, and so government will also have to take a share in this, restructuring.
So the statement concludes also by saying that the group has hired secured the services of a law firm. And there are some speculations out there that this could mean that Ghana could be facing a lawsuit because of the suspension of $13 billion worth of Eurobonds, as well as some commercial loans and bilateral obligations as well. In terms of this, you've talked about not taking unilateral action that could affect the coupon rate, the return on investment as well. Does the committee or those who have been invested, who are holding Ghana's Eurobonds, do they have a legal leg to stand on? What do you think?
Definitely they have a legal leg to stand on, but per the statement, it doesn't look as if this is what the first step they want to take. That is why they want broader negotiations and with the authorities of Ghanaians. And more importantly, Ghana has gotten a staff level agreement, so there's some level of comfort when there is also an external partner to this, to look at how best government of Ghana, the IMF, and also the creditors will come to a consensus in terms of the kind of restructuring that is going to happen going forward. And so I believe that the first option will not be a legal option, but they are looking forward to broader negotiations. What can government put on the table? What are the terms and agreements of such a restructure? And I think that is the first option that they would want to seek. Maybe when government breaches the terms, then they would want to take legal action. But from the statement, it's kind of a friendly statement to say that let's engage in broader negotiations so that we do not, take us by surprises with some of the unilateral decisions government would want to take.
So I need you to describe what Ghana is doing for me right now, because what we hear is S&P is calling this a selective default. Some are saying that Ghana's suspension of these loan repayments is an outright default, and others are saying it's just simply a step in the right direction in terms of the debt restructuring process. So how do you describe this suspension that Ghana has basically put on these investments that have been made by Eurobond holders and others?
And Ghana simply wants to avoid default. In that classic terms, like you are not able to meet your obligations when they fall due. So what government is trying to do is try to call, creditors, both external and domestic, to come on the table and have further conversations as to how best we can avoid default. And so different definitions have been given and different, titles have been given to this. But for me, I believe that Ghana wants to avoid the classic definition of default, whereby our obligations are falling due, but we are not able to meet them, hence going into a classic default. So that is why Ghana is choosing the part of calling investors and telling them that I will not be able to pay my, the interest on my loans and even the principal. So let us renegotiate the terms of the bond. As I speak to you now, Ghana is spending about 70% of its tax revenue in paying interest, and this is unsustainable. So this is a call or a step in the right direction to look at how best Ghana can do the debt restructuring so that you will ease the budget rigidities and, more importantly, to avoid default. Because once you default, investors, both domestic and external, wouldn't want to give you, funds going into the future.
So you talk about both domestic and external. So let's come to the domestic situation. We spoke about this just a few short weeks ago, which is, of course, the attempt that Ghana is making to restructure the local debt. And it was doing a debt exchange program, basically a debt swap. In the following weeks or days since that was announced and it kicked off on a Monday, Emmanuel, what's been the response? Has it been one in which you would think local investors do have some level of confidence in the Ghanaian government's ability to scale through this? Or have we not seen the level of take up or take on that we would want to see?
Well, it's not even easy for government. In our previous interview, I mentioned that government could have done broader consultation so that you don't take investors by surprise. But as I speak to you now, the Trade Unions Congress, which is the mother body of all labor unions, has indicated that on 27th of December, if government does not exempt their pensions, they are going to go on industrial strike. And I think this is a time for government to negotiate and do broader consultation with labor, because that is their pension. And permit me to go through some numbers. If you look at the domestic debt component, commercial banks, they hold about 30%, firms and institutions about 23%, then SNET close to about 1%. But institutional investors that are in the pension schemes, they fall within the 23% bracket. So I think government should be able to calculate the numbers and see whether they will be able to exempt them from pension. Ghana has 3-tier pension regime. We have the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So if there is a hit from the institutional investors like mutual funds, and then they are going to also take a hit on their pensions, I think that is too harsh. And so government should be able to look at the numbers, if it is possible, exempt them from their pensions. Because from next year, if you're not paying, coupon rate on bond holders, it means that pension trust funds will not be able to disburse as they envisage to their pensioners, and that will be very dire, because these are not working class people. These are retired civil servants and private sector people. So I think government should be able to negotiate with them, but if it is possible, government should be able to exempt pensions from this debt swap.
And that was my next question, but you've taken us through that, because they are saying that at this point, they don't want any involvement. And as you said, as institutional investors, the pension funds are deeply involved in the local debt market. So let's come to something that the president, Nana Akufo-Addo, has said. He's made some promises. We've also heard promises from the Minister of Finance, Ken Ofori-Atta. But the president pledged to restore financial discipline by reducing total public debt to 55% of the GDP by 2028, and then also pegging external debt servicing costs at no more than 18% of annual revenue by the same year. This is 2022, right on the cusp of 2023. That would give him 5 years to sort of turn around this situation we're finding Ghana in. Do you think he can keep that promise in 5 years? What would need to be done to sort of overhaul the economic situation that Ghana is in?
Fortunately or unfortunately, the President Akufo-Addo will not be in power by 2028. His tenure of office ends in 2024. So the emphasis now and the question should be 2023 and 2024. What is government going to do? If you look at the 2023 budget, it's still expansionary budget. If you look at the expenditure allocations, about 200 billion from about 137 billion in 2022. So it tells you that there's still an expansionary budget that government would want to execute. But how can you cut down on expenditure? I think the emphasis now should be on how government can cut further the expenditure allocation so that you'll be able to reduce your budget deficit. And on the other side, what are the new tax measures that government is going to introduce? In the 2023 budget, there are two key revenue items. The first one is increasing VAT by 2.5%, and government envisaged to raise in excess of 22 billion. But it all depends on the approval, the timely approval of these tax handles. Because of what we faced last year, there was a policy handle called the electronic levy. Because it was not passed on time, the revenue allocation at the time of the passage of the budget has reduced from 7 billion to about less than $1 billion. Then as I speak to you now, in the 2022 budget, government envisaged to raise about 611 million from a projected revenue of about 7 billion. So it depends on the timely approval of these two handles, i.e. the VAT increment and also the e-levy reduction, which has been reduced, the rate has been reduced from 1.5% to 1%. By so doing, you'll be able to reduce your budget deficit, and you will also be reducing your public debt in that regard.
So I want to go back to S&P Global, and of course, in terms of that, there's selective defaults. But one thing they also said that I want us to take cognizance of is the fact that if government fails to make the next scheduled coupon payment on its commercial foreign currency debt, then they would have to give Ghana D, meaning default. But there's this suspension in play. So when is this next scheduled coupon payment, and how do you think things will play out with this particular suspension that the Ghanaian government has put in place? Does it automatically mean that the ratings agencies will be left with no other choice but to rank Ghana as defaulting? Where do we go?
That's a very good question. That is why in the earlier submission I said it depends on how fast government negotiates with these creditors. Because if you are not careful, you want to avoid the default, as in a classic default, whereby you have liquidity challenges, so you are not able to, meet your obligations. So it behoves on government to fast track the negotiations with these external creditors, so that once you have a plan to restructure external debt, then you will be able to avoid, in some terms, that classic default, so that the credit rating agencies will not rate you as default, because default will not be good for a country like Ghana. We still largely need the external creditors to be investing in our economy, and so default will not be augur war for us in the short to medium term. And so government will have to fast track negotiations with these external creditors to avoid classic default.
All right. So now, after the announcement that Ghana had reached the staff level agreements with the IMF for that $3 billion loan, we saw the currency of Ghana, the CD, rebounding, going from the worst performing currency in 2022 to basically one of the better performing, one of the best performers in that span, basically, analyzing the span of that week or so. But when you now also look at how people are saying austerity measures may be put into place, we're hearing, of course, from the Committee of Creditors that even Ghana may need to take some of that pressure, may need to take some of the sacrifice as well. Economists are saying the next couple of years are going to be hard. And you've said the president is leaving in basically a year plus. 2024, he's out. It's going to be somebody else's headache to sort of carry on in getting things right. But when it comes to the tough times ahead, how tough and how painful do you think Ghanaians should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, it's going to largely depend on an IMF program because we have already applied for a program and we are going to get about 3 billion. But before the board of the IMF will approve the program, in the statement released last week, the fund is so clear that there should be sufficient progress made on this domestic and then external debt restructuring. And so once that is able to be done, Ghana will be able to avoid some of the pain that hitherto that the country would have gone through. Because once Ghana gets onto an IMF program, we will receive some balance of payment support. There will be some level of investor confidence coming back. So we will be able to avoid that level of pain that has been predicted and projected by some analysts and economists. So I believe that the faster we get the program, then we'll be able to avoid some of the pain that have been envisaged by some analysts and economists.
All right, Emmanuel, before I let you go, some say oftentimes situations like this can help reset, rewrite, and, put the country on a different track. And there might be a silver lining, because inside a crisis is also an opportunity. What opportunities do you think lie within the situation Ghana finds itself, especially as we think of the next decade, the next generation, the future of the economy as well? What are the opportunities within this situation?
Unfortunately, Ghana has not been able to utilize opportunities after, macroeconomic stability. We have been doing this for the past 16 times. This is our 17th program we have applied for. I think this is about the time that we should be able to take our destiny into our own hands. What can be done with macroeconomic stability? I believe that government should be able to use macroeconomic stability to first formalize Ghana's economy, because Ghana's economy is largely informal. So the first thing is to formalize Ghana's economy. Again, we should be able to raise domestic revenue. And I don't mean increasing taxes, but what are the other things that we can do? We have to broaden our tax net. We have a largely informal sector. How do we get them to contribute their quota to building a strong nation? And the third one is for us to look at industrialization, i.e. import substitution industrialization and export-led industrialization. Ghana imports largely almost everything that we consume. And I think as an emerging market, for us to have a resilient economy, we should be able to invest in, industrialization that will plug the imports that we do. No country in this world can produce all that they need, but there are some goods and services that we can produce within. We have comparative advantage. Let's build on it. And I am happy that in the 2023 budget, government has earmarked about 110 hectares of farmland to go into commercial farming, i.e. the things that we import in volumes like rice and like poultry. And so I look forward to a success of such a program so that we'll be able to reduce the burden of importation, because once you are importing a lot, you also put pressure on your currency. As I speak to you now, before last 2 weeks, Ghana's cedi was one of the worst performing in the world. You'll be able to sustain this appreciation when you're able to build import substitution industries and export-led industries.
All right, Emmanuel, we'll leave it at that for now. We know this is a continuing conversation. Of course, we're watching very closely to see what organized labor as well will decide to do if they're going to go on that nationwide strike on the 27th. So I know we'll probably be talking to you in the next few days. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
and the situation that's unfolding in West Africa with the second largest economy in the region is one we've been following very, very closely. Let's get back to who the local debt holders are, and we can also focus a bit on, of course, what the pension funds and some of the local unions are saying. So if I can get that on the screen now in terms of who's holding Ghana's local debt, what we know right now is there is the threat of a nationwide strike, and that's because organized labor is asking the government to exempt pension funds from this debt exchange program, from this debt swap that's happening. There are a number of local investors who are holding bonds, of course, for Ghana, and they've said they may not really be interested in as much of the swap or the program, the exchange program, as possible. And then when you go to the international, to the Eurobond holders, and you look at who's holding Ghana's debt as well, that's also another conversation. So in terms of domestic debt, what we're seeing is that you have insurance, you have companies, rural banks, pension funds making 6%, foreign investors 9%, others are 14%. Then you have Social Security and National Insurance Trusts and commercial banks with firms and others. So they, particularly those with the pension funds and the local organizing unions, are saying leave the pension funds out of your restructuring. They don't want to take any losses. They don't want to take any haircuts. And there could be a strike coming from this if they say government does not compromise or go back on its decision. And you can see the breakdown there of Ghana's total debt, 42% being domestic with 58% being external. Let's look at who's holding Ghana's external debt as it is right now, with the Eurobond holders forming a committee in that regard. And they want to be in on everything that Ghana is doing. They want a conversation where they're involved, as well as the International Monetary Fund. Creditors, Eurobond holders saying that, nope, Ghana, not so fast. Whatever conversations you're having, yourself, the IMF, we want to be involved. No more unilateral decisions. The services of a law firm have been secured, but it may not necessarily mean that there's going to be any legal maneuvering in the coming days. But let's see how all of this plays out. There hasn't been an official response as of yet from the Ghanaian government. This statement coming out yesterday with the announcement of that committee of Ghana's Eurobond holders. Of course, as we said, it's an unfolding, developing story, one we continue to keep our eyes on.